Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the panel. This is the digital mediation of analog play. I'm your co-host, Colin Stricklin.
And I'm Raph D'Amico. It's good to be here.
Oh man, this is going to be a fun one. We've been chatting a little bit already, and there is a lot to go over. Let us begin by doing that narcissistic thing and talking a little bit about ourselves, who we are, and why we're famous. So I am Colin Stricklin. I am a PhD student over at Georgia Tech, and I am interested in pretty much the title of this biz, digital mediation of analog play. I have a particular focus on streaming digitally streaming actual play RPGs. We're talking critical role type stuff. I do a bit of design work in terms of Pathfinder, Starfinder, 5th edition, Dungeons and Dragons for a little third-party outfit called AdventureWeek.com. And as far as content creation, my extraordinarily talented wife is a pretty good illustrator. She does a comic called Handbook of Heroes, that's handbookofheroes.com, that I write for, which goes over different aspects of being a game master. But tonight, I am mostly coming at you from my scholarly side, what qualifies me to be here. And as much time as I spend on Pathfinder campaigns and comic scripts, the reason I'm sitting on this panel is to try and sharpen and hone my PhD proposal, which is hopefully, fingers crossed, coming in the fall. In a word, my research is focused on active audiences and the digital transmission of analog gameplay. The field covers performance studies, fan studies, game design, and also a lens on culture and technology. And these various fields create a particular kind of intersection. At the highest level, my research focuses on the transmission of gameplay via streaming platforms like YouTube and Twitch. But rather than video games, though, I'm focusing my research on analog play. We're talking board games, tabletop role-playing games, highly social and conventionally face-to-face forms of play. We're talking about the shift in perspective between playing for one's own entertainment in a small group and then playing for the benefit of this large digital outside audience. But more specifically, I want to emphasize the role of the audience in shaping this new performative situation. Now, the particular streams I'm interested in feature groups of players engaged in tabletop role-playing games. Think Dungeons and Dragons in the US, Europe's The Dark Eye, or Japan's preferred Call of Cthulhu genre. Chances are, if you're in this panel, you know what this business is about. Now, this brand of actual play programming and its characteristic relationships between players, game, developers, it tends to look far different than the solitary experience of live streaming video game play. Even at a glance, it's easy to tell that solo digital streaming and social analog streaming are very different beasts. There's also the ever popular question of motivation. Why do people play and watch these streams? And these are both important questions. What I think is unique about my take is the move from performative gameplay in its private context, entertaining your buddies around the kitchen table, to that broader milieu of the outside audience. How do we characterize that move from kitchen table to digital broadcast? How do we describe the socio-technical elements that shape it? And my current projects are a reaction to these questions. Very briefly, I'm first working on developing an aesthetics of analog streaming. This theoretical work pulls on philosopher Kendall Walton's prop theory and ultimately argues that the ambiguity between fan works and their fan object is magnified in tabletop role-playing. As an adventure designer, I can tell you that GMing a session feels an awful lot like writing a product. That crossover isn't just in gameplay either, but in the culture that comes with this hobby. There's this famous Gygax quote, co-creator of D&D, Gary Gygax, where he says, "It is the spirit of the game and not the letter of the rules," which is important. And I think that humility on the part of the designer, the willingness to say that this most fundamental part of a game, it's rules, you can throw that out. That shows this willingness to listen to outside voices. And that includes the voices of this new outside audience. How exactly do we go about accommodating that audience, though? And that brings on the second of my ongoing projects, which aims to answer these questions. It's happily a little less theoretical. This summer, I'm working on a corpus analysis project focused on audience participation in TRPG podcasts. It follows up on Gary Allen Fine's classic Shared Fantasy. That's the 1980-something ethnography on D&D, and elaborates on his vision of RPGs composed of three different frames of human behavior: the social, the gameplay, and the game world. And my goal was to discover whether audiences displayed more interest in a particular frame. What exactly were their conversations about? Fictional characters, the relationships between players, the show as a show? As a first step in answering these questions, I'm relying on a suite of freeware corpus analysis tools called AntConf to look at the Glass Cannon podcast. Some of you may have heard of it. AntConf was developed for concordancing and text analysis, and it's going to help me find patterns in the very noisy noise of YouTube comments. With the help of some interviews and actual humans this fall, I'm hoping to describe the ways that audiences interact with these texts. Where does their interest lie? What do they look for? Are they able to switch frames as easily as the players? And as for my ultimate ambition, imagine developing a taxonomy of the ways that audiences alter content. Twitch chat is obvious, but on-air shoutouts to fan statisticians, devices like pledge X dollars at X tier, and you can send in a critical hit effect that we'll use on the show, and even the use of fan art on stream are all relevant here. Once you chart the mechanisms at work, you can create a toolkit for audience engagement. You can even design an artifact to test the efficacy of that framework. Maybe some kind of experimental podcast, maybe some kind of experimental game. And that is exactly where I could see my work going in the next few years.
Oh, there's so much that I'm excited to talk to you about here. And if we go back one slide, so many jumping off points for conversation. Now I'm gonna do my version of this same spiel, and then we will combine the streams to fight the Ghostbusters of conversation. I'm Raph, and I'm a professional UX designer by day, and just a practitioner in the world of designing collaborative tools that are not games. And I also make games, tabletop role-playing games. And the angle that I want to bring into this conversation is this journey of the last 3 years of making a physical tabletop game and then having to adapt it at the beginning of the pandemic to digitally mediated play. I see my friend Amber Autumn in the chat. Hello. And it's so exciting to think how this is going to mesh in the conversation. So, for example, The Zone is a game. It's been described as Jackbox meets Annihilation. It's a journey into a lethal, dangerous, magical realist zone that everyone except one person is going to be mutated and killed by. And this is fated at the beginning. And as you get deeper and deeper, you change in very strange and mysterious ways until you have a chance to give the zone your greatest wish. And of course, it'll grant it in a very unexpected way. Or will it at all? And so let me talk about a few interesting elements I think relates this topic of digital mediation that I've learned from this experience and from my practice as an interaction designer. So if we go to the next slide, it's that question. What happens when you adapt a physical game to digital mediation? So the first thing that happens, if we go to the next bit, is you immediately run into this very interesting problem of directing attention. Now, when you're at the table together, you can see where everyone is looking. You can see that everyone can see that you can see that everyone can see wherever you are looking. And that feedback loop has a very important effect in terms of driving where attention goes on the table. If I can tell that Colin is looking at the dragon in the center of the table, I find myself looking at that, and then other people in a cascade will end up having their attention drawn in the same way.
Oh, but you lose that in the Roll20 experience, yeah?
And you lose it completely. So this is a screenshot of Zoom, right? Just look at the cognitive style of, instead of having everyone looking in at the center, now you've got everyone looking out like windows. It's like you're on the side of a building. And so the very first challenge with digitally mediated interaction, and it's kind of cool that Amber Autumn's here in the stream, because Amber Autumn was one of the people who hosted the first attempts to playtest the game in Tabletopia, in a digital space, we immediately ran into this problem. And you have to create rituals around it. And there's things that we're all familiar with from our daily life. So, everyone uses Google Docs. Google Docs has cursors that show you where someone is about to type. And that sense of what's the intention behind the movements of people in a space that lets you predict what they're about to do is just so crucial. Because by the time the action has happened, it's too late to really react to it. We're constantly queuing off of things that other people are about to do. We need enough information to be able to see it. So that's like one really interesting pillar of this. A second interesting pillar. Oh, wait, and one last thing with directing attention. Sorry, I don't want to move on with this. Even when you move away from the table, one of the things you take for granted at the table is everyone can see the same thing. In a digital space, you actually lose that. The assumption is not everyone can see the same thing. The assumption is, well, we're all looking at this screen. I hope we're seeing the same thing. And so even very basic things that you all took for granted are now not so basic and taken for granted. So let's go to the next slide. The second thing is nonverbal participation. And you'll see all these pillars are very related to each other. But when I'm talking to you, I am constantly adjusting the things I'm saying, the tone I'm using, the cadence, based on factors that are in your body language, in the turn taking that's happening between us. I can see if you're either, are you getting bored with me rambling on, or are you lighting up with something that I'm saying? It's a two-way street. Communication, even when someone is talking, is a two-way street because you're picking up constant cues that are helping you calibrate from the other person. And that's another thing that when you start digitally mediating things, that becomes just way harder to read. So there was a study that showed that it was actually easier for people to get nonverbal cues from a phone call than from a video call, because over the phone, and when you only had the audio signals, you're picking up all these very, very subtle back and forth signals. Even the tiniest silence at a particular time implies something about the communication. Whereas in video, with more people in it, or with the distraction of the video signal and slight delays there that are more than audio, it became harder to pick up. So that second thing of how do you make sure that people have nonverbal channels that match the verbal channels that are happening in the game? If I'm talking, can I emote? Can I peanut gallery off on the side? Like in Twitch has the wonder of having the chat off to the side, right? But there's a bunch of patterns. And I put in this GIF of one of my favorite examples is this, which is the game Journey, the PlayStation game where you can only communicate non-verbally with these beautiful pings that generate energy and with body language. So that's a second really interesting challenge when you start digitally mediating interactions. The game designer actually needs to figure out how to reinsert those into the experience. Let's go to the next one. The third thing is presence. And this might seem similar to the previous one, but it's actually, I think there's a subtle difference, which is, what does it mean to be embodied at the table? Like, what does it mean to be able to reach out, to a table? Everyone understands the concept of table presence, right? When you have a board game, like, one of my favorites, Eclipse, which fills an entire table when you're playing it, and you have this epic sweep, and then you condense it down onto your laptop screen in Tabletopia, it's not the same thing. Or in Tabletop Simulator. And so I actually think scale matters, and table presence matters. Like there's something, when you're watching a well-produced stream of a D&D game, or you create one on your kitchen table with sheets sprawling out over the table and the DM screen and minis and the effect of reaching over and doing something, or even rolling a die, like it's something that has weight. I put this example of the Dragonstone strategic table from Game of Thrones. It's such an interesting, piece of furniture to me, in that it's as important in this scene as the characters. And underneath it is an equally epic table from a tabletop simulator Battlestar Galactica game, but it's big, but it's also tiny because on your screen it's like 10 inches wide. That also has an impact, has to be designed around. And next thing. This one starts kind of bringing some of these points together. And again, it's a slightly different lens, but they're very related. The fundamental thing that I think games that have boards, that have, you know, a central thing that people are gathered around is this sense of what I call the campfire. The sense of everyone is having their attention drawn into a central place, and that central place takes on a great deal of energy. You know, Colin's going to have the deepest frameworks to explain this that I look forward to us diving into further. But I experience it just as this feeling of, you know, Huizinga's the magic circle just forming around you as you all center your energy on this one spot and have it manifest something greater. And this point really almost like brings in a lot of the different points. But what I think makes it slightly different than the others is this idea of, and the reason I like the campfire as a metaphor is that the campfire provides this light that is lighting everyone from one side, and then you go a little bit further out and then you get to darkness. And we've all had that experience of you're around the campfire, you take a few steps out, and it's pitch black. It's as if it were a wall or like an infinite void. It's almost like the rest of the world stops existing. And that specific feeling is something that, again, I think when you're creating a digitally mediated game, everyone is split up and you have to use all kinds of tricks to recreate that. And then the last thing, and this is you know, me pulling it all together. When I was adapting the zone, you know, I could talk for hours about all the different mechanics that we're trying to address this, but I think it's interesting looking through these frameworks to look at just how a single thing might end up hitting a lot of these. So one of the decisions I made was to have these glowing cursors that represent the different players as they're playing the game. And so you can see everyone's cursors going around the screen like these little kind of glow flies. And they end up helping you to turn take because they show when someone's about to click on a button or an action so you don't do it, or they show that someone's about to do something exciting and you can anticipate it, which enhances it. They're using anonymous voting at various points, like at the beginning of the game to decide the rating. You all hold your glowing cursors either on the left side to PG-13 or on the right side for R-rated. So again, it's like using your attention to get a social coordination effect. They create nonverbal participation because if someone's excited, they'll like, you know, jiggle their cursor around like you know, like a glowfly dancing in excitement. They're thematic. It was really important to me how, you know, if you use Google Docs, it's a little cursor with your name on it. But if it's the zone, it's a kind of more atmospheric game. So you want it to feel more like you are this like slightly mythical creature. And when you die in the game, you become the zone. And so this gives you a chance to embody it and to start almost role-playing. And then, you know, I actually think one of the details in digital mediated games that I think is massively underappreciated is the importance of fidgeting. Like, how many of you listening right now, when you're sitting at a table playing a tabletop game or board game, are just like fidgeting, like counters or dice or like paper?
We talked about dice stacking.
Come on, like, how many dice have you stacked, Colin? You know what I mean.
They get so tall that they always fall.
And look what happens on a computer screen. Well, you end up fidgeting with your email. You end up looking at your tabs. And so if you don't capture that fidgeting, then the energy just leaves the game, like leaving a window open in winter.
And people literally leave the game and go check out Reddit or their email or whatever.
Right. And so you have to have all these little patterns you're throwing at them. It's like, no, I'm going to distract you with this and we'll use this. And I think it was really interesting for me when I was deciding, like, am I going to invest the engineering efforts, like figure out how to do these cursors? And I was like, I don't know. But then when I realized how many different of these digital mediation points they hit, I decided to do it. And so I'm just scratching the surface. It's a brand new world here, and there's like other people doing like just the most incredible stuff. And there's just so much opportunity to spot what people are doing, because I think as we're all exploring the space, we're going to be doing things we don't even realize are important until other wonderful smart folks come and riff off us. So I want to leave part with a final thing before we get into conversation. And that's just this idea called Thigmotaxis. I discovered this while I was exploring just the architecture of spaces. And colloquially, it's a term for, like, if you imagine, a small animal like this badger here from the wonderful video game Shelter, trying to make it across a field. There's an evolutionary behavior, which is to go off to the corner and avoid the big open space and just hug the edges, because millions of years of evolution have taught you that you probably shouldn't just be in the middle of an open field when there's predators that can fly down and eat you. And you see this in humans. So humans with agoraphobia, for example, people with agoraphobia or anxiety are more likely in experiments to not cross a courtyard going directly across it, but to kind of hug the edges. It's a very deep-seated part of us. And I want to throw this in as a provocation as we get into this conversation about digital mediation, which is, if we're going to go into this space of digital mediated games that are streamed, that have any number of people coming in and watching, how do we do that in a way that's safe and that avoids triggering this response, of the predator swooping down from on high? And how does this apply to digital spaces? I think it's kind of cool. So yeah, that's me. That's these are some of the things that I think about far too much. Yeah. Let's get into some questions, Colin.
Yeah, let's see what we've got here, because we were talking a little bit about this fear response earlier, right? And you and I were mentioning Fluxus artists, this idea that you can put yourself somewhat in the hands of an audience, and examples being Yoko Ono with her project where you can cut off her clothes if you let her. That's a very invasive thing for an audience person to do that to an artist, and putting yourself in that fundamentally uncomfortable situation. That's an odd sort of design space. So the motivation, how would you convince somebody as a player, as a streamer, to allow the audience to exert such control over who I am, what I'm doing, what I'm allowed to do in the game?
And how, yeah, and what that makes me think about is even the act of entering a stream. You still there, Colin?
Yeah, cut out for a second.
I see you. Oh, hey, everyone. I'm realizing that I'm spread out over the Twitch stream in a fascinating way. I think there's something really striking about this question, because it's already just so vulnerable to be on a stream in the first place. It's a very vulnerable space. Suddenly you're no longer just playing a role-playing game with your friends. You're out in public. Anyone can drop by and say things about what you're doing. And one of the things that I think about is there's the feeling of someone says something, what do I do with it? But I think there's also something to the potential for something to be said. You ever think about as soon as you go into this public space, you're performing, even before anyone has said anything. It's already changed your behavior.
You're talking about Goffman, Irving Goffman, and the presentation of self in everyday life.
Yeah.
And this is the idea that we are always performing. I'm sure that all of you have had the insight that I behave differently in church versus with my buddies back playing at the creek versus in my principal's office. We behave differently. And sociologist Irving Goffman. That's what we do. We adapt our behaviors to different social situations. And that's not necessarily prevaricating or lying somehow. That is simply adapting the self to the circumstance.
Yeah, and when you ask that provocation of, how do I get someone to kind of submit or kind of use what's coming up in the chat?
But look, this is scary, right?
Well, there's this really interesting thing where, like, on the one hand, it's really terrifying because suddenly you've got this performance anxiety. I'll use I statements. I get hefty performance anxiety if I'm streaming. Suddenly I'm like, ooh, this is recorded for all posterity. But then I
Well,
think there's
congratulations, Raph. You've just signed up for my interview sessions this fall. I need that exact reaction.
Noted. I'll put it on a post-it note and read it off exactly in 6 months. But here's an interesting thing too. I think there's an opportunity for it to feel supportive as well, where I think there's also a sense when you're in a role-playing game of like you're out on a tightrope, and sometimes you actually don't know what to do. So I think there's actually an opportunity for the relationship between the audience and the players to also be supportive to the players. That feeling of, in my first ever Zone stream, I was really impressed by Tony Vazinda was hosting the stream, and he was doing such a wonderful job of just asking people in the stream for like, oh, hey, what do you think should happen to my character at this point? And I see the best streamers almost integrate the input of the people watching into the game in a way that just like helps you.
Oh, and of course, if you talk about actors, they will tell you that they use something vague like the energy in the house to help shape their conversations, to hone their performance rather. And it is how they give a reading. Say they can react dynamically to that audience. But a lot of that is hard to quantify. You can see Twitch stream though. You can get a broad sense of what the text that's streaming by, and you can react accordingly. It's this idea. I think there's this weird thing that happens when you take a game that we play. It's already a performative. We're performing for ourselves, one another, and you point this camera at it, this large digital outside audience, Big Brother eye looking at you, and it fundamentally changes the performative situation. But at the same time, it's so important for streamers in these games to maintain this sense of authenticity. Keyword, kids, authenticity. That no, I'm just a person playing a game. I would not be playing any differently if it were just me and my buddies at home, because that's what we're trying to shoot. It's what we're pointing the camera at, is the experience of play. And it's a fiction that we almost have to maintain, because that's what we're trying to record. But games are weird, man. You can't record the experience of play. It becomes something else when you point the camera at it, almost fundamentally.
What do you think are some of the things that change when you point the camera at it? What does it morph into in a Lovecraftian way almost?
Well, Raph, I can guarantee you, I don't talk with my hands quite this much when I'm not on a Discord stream for a panel. But you put on the performative persona. Sitting on my research committee is a fellow by the name of Phil Oslander, wrote a book called Liveness, and in some of his more recent work, he talks about this performative persona. It's not so much in the example of, say, a musician, the music that one is performing, as one's persona. It is this construct that you put together, this presence on the stage that you are performing. And it's been a little while since I read the stuff, and I don't want to misapply the work, but I think that when you turn a camera onto play, especially when it's memetic play, pretend play, rather than agonistic play, first-person shooter tournaments, there is more of a sense of trying to change that persona, to change the way you behave to suit the situation. And so we are back to Goffman and the performance of the self.
That's so fascinating that you just brought in this idea of the competitive versus the, I don't know what the other end of the spectrum is called, but this idea that when you're performing in a competitive situation, the crowd is almost something that you want to shut out. It gives you energy in some way, but it's like a pressure creating a diamond almost kind of vibe, right? Where you just need to be more, not performative, but more just purely activity that you're doing.
Where I want there to be more research, because I'm paraphrasing Roger Kelwa, who wrote Man, Play, in Games, and he had these wonderful Latinate words to explain the different types of play. The agonistic play, the memetic play, ilix, I think, meaning the play that that relates to gravity, where you fall down, and this is the play we get from roller coasters and getting to play with our bodies in motion. But the difference between, I think, a lot of the work, just because of what's popular on streaming, tends to go towards agonistic play, competition between opposing forces. This is every first-person shooter deathmatch that you've ever seen. But streaming isn't just for that, even though it's very popular. It's also for memetic play, pretend play, acting, role play. And I think that the difference between it's much more when you're a baseball player, you get your game day face on. Game day face is a thing. You could call it a persona if you want to, but it's much more pronounced and it's different fundamentally when it is a memetic sort of play rather than one where your performance really matters.
I like the idea that I think that theory naturally would get to the next level of imagining that a baseball player walking onto the field is role playing as a baseball player the second that they enter the stadium and pop on their uniform. Correct word? I don't know.
This is what the digital mediation of play can do. It's one way to look at it. You point the camera and something shifts. Now, if we're talking about a professional ball player, perhaps it doesn't shift as much. Perhaps it isn't as pronounced as when you put on an entertainer role, myself, an academic talking to people role right now. But it definitely changes something, and trying to acknowledge that. And I think realizing that you aren't just looking at perfectly somebody in their candid camera behaving naturally. As soon as they're aware of the presence of the outsider, changes behavior because the social situation is fundamentally different.
So this really leads me to this interesting question. It's a kind of a twist on what you're saying, which is, how do you point the camera in the way that really enhances someone's performance in a way that benefits both themselves and others? And I think about, for example, an old piece of research on World of Warcraft that showed that people became more like their avatars. So, if you had an avatar that was like big and strong and powerful, you started taking on more of those traits in your kind of interactions with others on various personality scales. And it also makes me think about, I'll call it like the wedding dance effect, which is, that feeling where you're at like a party and you haven't decided yet if you want to dance or not. For me, the bar is pretty low, but like I know that line, and someone's like, "Oh, come dance, come onto the dance floor," and there's this moment where if you resist too much, it starts feeling inauthentic to actually do the thing that you want to do. There's this line that crosses where you're like, I kind of want to dance. Now I've resisted. If I stop resisting at a certain point, then I can kind of jump in fully authentically and really enjoy it. If I resist too much, then I have to get over this hump of being like, oh, I performed this behavior of someone who doesn't dance. And now I have to like unperform that to get back into that state.
Yeah,
And then you have these nice.
And maybe there's this moment where you have to tune out the audience and get over your self-awareness, and maybe that gets perhaps closer to just playing the game. But
Yeah.
fundamentally, don't think you can just play the game anymore when you know that you're on stage, when you know that you're performing. Straight up different.
But
this is interesting hearing. Before we sat down, I watched parts of your actual play of the zone, and so let me ask you, Raph, what is the difference playing the zone when you are just with your buddies and just in your own private stream versus knowing that there's that we're recording for YouTube or the Twitch stream is going live?
Well, it's a fascinating thing because I think when you're playing it with your buddies, the world very much disappears. The very first playtest of the zone that I ever did, one of my friends, he came up with a brilliant idea. He noticed that we were starting to play, and it was like maybe like 40 minutes before sunset. The game takes a few hours to play, and he was like, "Hey, let's get some flashlights and keep the lights off." And so as we're playing, the sun's gonna fall, and we're just gonna use the flashlights. We won't turn the lights on in the room. And so very subtly, as we were playing, it got darker and darker and darker, and we started like leaning further and further and further in, and struggling to see the paper, passing this one flashlight around, and 10 candles. I say hi right back. 10 Candles is a glorious example of this, with its burning of character sheets in the middle, and obviously the 10 candles that are your only light in the room. And so when you're playing a game like that in that setting, the rest of the world very much disappears, and it's almost very jarring. Like at the end of the game, you come out of it, and you're just like, where was I? And my experience of playing it on streams. Now, there's a big difference between playing it just mediated digitally versus playing it on a stream. So I'll say specifically streams with an audience is
a synchronous audience, a simultaneous audience.
Yeah. Is I think that sense of trying to tell a complete creepy story. Maybe this is one element where that sense of you're like the goosebumps, or you're kind of the Rod Serling at the beginning, in the Twilight Zone, just like starting to narrate. I think it enhances that side of it in a way that is pretty appealing, actually.
Yeah, you have a stance of being the narrator rather than just the participant in the story.
Yeah, there is a weirdness to it though, because it's a little bit harder to see other people's reactions, and so I think it disembodies you a little bit, where you kind of end up like looking at the pixels that represent people. And I would say that's probably the biggest difference. Like there's an opportunity, I think, I would imagine like the best way that it can go is if on a stream you have a better chance to just kind of lose yourself in it. Like if you really like, it might even make it more appropriate to literally close your eyes and to lose yourself in yourself, so that you have a better chance to not be distracted by the fact you're getting these impoverished signals from like Twitch and from like the pixels that are your friends. Whereas I think when you're in person, I think you can tune in a little bit more to trying to specifically creep out the three people who are across the table from you. So that feels like it would have a very different style. At this point,
your attention is less split. You're focusing on, I want to look at these people, their reactions, zone in on them, as opposed to trying to also encompass what a hypothetical audience is thinking and what the actual audience you can see on Twitch stream is reacting.
Yeah. I think it really comes down to this feeling of, I really want to try and creep out this one specific person who's sitting like 4 feet away from me. I'm going to try and like really like get under their skin with this horrible mutation that's happening to our characters. And that's definitely a little bit harder on stream.
We talk about these different elements of gameplay in role-playing games in particular. And I always go back to Gary Allen Fine and his 1980s ethnography of D&D, Shared Fantasy. And there he cut up the experience of play into 3 distinct frames. He had the social frame, the gameplay frame, and the game world frame. And I think that we tend to focus a little bit on the social because it's what we do in day-to-day life. It's what we experience. But I have with this question as a point of discussion, as a provocation. How does streaming change the game itself? And I'm talking about mechanics and design rather than the social aspect. How does streaming change the gameplay? I guess this is a question for you as a designer.
Yeah, I think what I'm really excited about is the something that I would be really, really interested in seeing is game design that takes into account how many people are watching, that kind of grows with it. Like there's a big difference between streaming, and I've had this experience where like you're playing with your friends and you're streaming and there's like 3 other people watching that you also know are your friends. And that's almost like a hangout, right? Like the idea of a game becoming just a place where other people can drop in and just kind of hang out with you. They can watch. I think that's a really interesting social pattern that I'd want to lean into as a game designer, because one of the things I'm most excited about with streaming culture is that it's created all these amazing campfires for the community. Like just like my most like undying respect to all the people who are running all these streams, and they're creating just gathering places essentially where players gather with each other. Right. Even like what we're doing right now. I mean, like, it's not a new thing, but that pattern of like, we met because of this. It's wonderful. And now there's people in this chat who are kind of like orbiting around it, and who will have a chance to meet with each other, and we'll have a chance to meet with them. And I think designing games that create that sense of continuity, that create a sense, like I see this in video games a lot, where like a game having an unsolvably hard, complex system at its heart, like a Spelunky 2, or obviously Minecraft, or many others, creates this continuous interaction between the game designers and the people playing and the people watching, where there's very porous. Like people are going from the I'm watching to being a player to being a watcher to being a player. And I think it'd be really interesting to see the kind of RPG space evolve in that direction of, could you have games where there is a more porous relationship between the people who are playing and the watchers?
Oh, academic words. Good academic words. The porous relationship.
Porous relationship, yes. TM. Now, like, I'd be fascinated to have a relationship where, like, as a game gets more play, there's mechanics within the game itself to be like, oh, hey, like one of the people watching, you're going to be an NPC in this game for like.
What is that? What is the game that you and I were talking about earlier? It was Choice Chamber.
Oh yeah, exactly.
It was the first video game designed specifically for Twitch, in which the audience could vote on. Well, in the next chamber, in this 2D platformer, you get this power up. You can jump high. You have a pogo jump now, where you can't stop jumping. The enemies get bigger, or they start flying, or whatever. And elevating one of the audience to an NPC, exactly like you say, they're able to input specific commands to a semi-autonomous little device called a gizmo that might shoot at some of the enemies and help you out. So you give this sense of agency to the audience, and you actually incorporate them into the game by design. And my God, Raph, what would it look like if you were to design a RPG from the ground up that does specifically that?
Isn't it thrilling? And I think what we've seen, in the last however many years, it's been just unbelievably awesome to see the development of safety techniques and calibration tools for role-playing games that help people play harder and safer in more different settings, where the idea of playing safely with your friends expanding to like, oh, what happens when I have a group of people who don't know each other? How can they quickly calibrate to make sure they have an experience that allows them to all play a game in a way that is safe, but also allows them to come
about X card type stuff, right?
Exactly. Like X card. There's so many tools, like Lines and Veils, the door is always open. The list just goes on. Now, to develop these patterns for broadening that to larger audience, like we know that there's a lot of toxicity on the internet. Video game companies have been like trying to fight it. Twitch, the platform's been trying to fight it. But I think building in safety tools that work at broader and broader levels of community to start bringing more people in, like there's brand new mechanics to be discovered there to keep it to keep these interactions, to allow them to scale without, and someone I'm kind of scrolling up through the chat, put it really well, that there is a big difference between good-natured trash talk and heartfelt emotional support. That I think that would have to move from being a platform responsibility to being something that was embedded like in the heart of these games, if they want to be able to interact more directly with the community like this. It's just one thought. There's so much to discover. What do you think?
It really is interesting trying to think of the different states of streaming, because it isn't just, like you said, this big 100,000 people watching these sort of thing. Let's have 1,500 people vote on the next thing they want to see, which is fairly basic. You can get that mess off of American Idol. There's this great article by Rainforest Scully Blaker called Playing Along and Playing For on Twitch, where Rainforest basically says that at some point, when you hit a tipping point where there are so many people that you can't really have a personal connection, you can't have a personal relationship, you don't talk to them in the Twitch. This is when you have 10,000 people just blowing up your chat, and you actually literally cannot follow what's happening. And you would have to have a very different style of game. I mean, how does a choice chamber can scale? Because, well, we're just doing simple votes. But if we have ways for some sort of audience member to become an NPC? Oh, that's too direct. How else? What if it was some sort of not necessarily within the game itself, but what if there was some amalgamation of games? The multiverse concept. What if you were able to do a spin-off? And what I'm thinking when I say this, it remains fascinating to me that Paizo, the guys that make Pathfinder, were originally made a setting in Dragon Magazine for Wizards of the Coast for splitting off and maintaining profitability with their own intellectual property. After this, the Critical Role guys, they do a home campaign set in the world of Galarian. They change it up a little bit and turn it into this massively successful thing and are able to monetize that in turn. They produce their own setting book. And I've seen at least one podcast that is their own storyline within that world. And what does it look like when, from an intellectual property perspective, we allow all these worlds to exist and do not throttle them? And how can you allow that sort of thing? How can you maintain profitability for the designer and give cultural cachet to all the fans out here who are already doing their fanish activities?
And this is something that I think we immediately bonded over when we were talking earlier, which is just the idea of headcanon and celebrating fan work, celebrating the ownership that fans have over properties. And I think there's so much similarity between archives of our own and potentially this culture of having you've got the game supporting streams that are then supporting layers of fans that are creating their own things that go back into it and kind of bringing their own experience to it. And
my theory on the subject is that it is almost unique to tabletop RPGs, that this is expected behavior. Now, Raph, I know that you were into the modding community. You were changing video games, and you weren't monetizing it, I don't believe.
I wasn't.
But there have been various and sundry attempts at allowing monetized modding, but they tend to fall apart a little bit, or it's hard to certainly make a career out of this, or even pretend that you are some kind of a designer. But my own work in the open gaming license, making products for this world of either 5e D&D or Pathfinder or what have you. The 3.5 open gaming license is a little more open than the 5e equivalent if we're talking specifics. But there's this expectation that here's a product that is not complete. It does not function unless you change it. You have to change it. You have to put some of yourself in it in order for the machine to run. And what kind of culture is that allows you, that takes the ego of the designer out and allows and expects the fans to make their own thing out of it? There's a certain freedom there. And I think that the rest of the creative industry might be able to learn some useful lessons from that.
It's just the coolest thing ever about this whole scene. It's why I love it so much. Like the idea that you're not creating something, and don't get me wrong, I'm the biggest film fan in the world. But I think there's something wonderful about like the commitment of this industry to creating experiences where it's like, no, you're not going to consume 2 hours of, and by the way, when I watch a movie, I have like a Carl Sagan like response to just the amount of human creativity that goes into every second of a movie. You're just like,
you watch a tentpole picture like a Star Wars or a Marvel film, and you're like, all that talent. My God.
Right. It's like every minute of this movie burnt $2 million and like 10,000 people's worth.
Dude, I saw the Star Wars costume exhibit at the Denver Art Museum a couple of years back, and just looking at all the those people deserved Oscars. My God.
Right. Right. My one for that is the people who made the mutant vehicles in Mad Max Fury Road. Like there's like an incredible craftsman who made every one of those 70 insane vehicles and that drove around the desert of Namibia, being flipped over and blown up. Well, and the reason I bring that up is I think there's something magical about the fact that, it's not that we're designing pieces of content that you're just consuming. We're designing frameworks that let you create your own creativity with your friends. It's just a magical thing.
And what I'm trying to suss out, like what I'm trying to picture is there's this concept by a scholar by the name of McKay. Did the tabletop role-playing game, A New Performing Art. I think that's close to the title of his book. But he has this concept of the imaginary entertainment environment. That's what he calls it. An entertainment environment being something like an amusement park, where you're designing space that is for the people. But the imaginary entertainment environment, it is only something that you can access retroactively. It's this thing that you build with your fellow co-creatives that you remember, and that is the aesthetic object, the stories that we tell ourselves about our games.
So that makes it's interesting to think, like, does the stream itself become like an aesthetic object? Does the stream itself become a thing that is created because of this game that then gets built on? Because that's the other thing that streams inherently end up doing a lot of the time is they're recording the game. They're recording the play in a way that may allow it to be built on in different ways. So now you've got this artifact, you played the game. There's this 3-hour recording. What happens in the future if YouTube gets really good at automatically summarizing things, right? So that you can then go back to it and be like, oh, what were the 4 most salient moments of this thing that we want to build off of?
We're in the process of expanding on McKay right now because he imagined that this is the imaginary entertainment environment is something you can't access as an outside viewer. You have to be there. You have to be playing in the moment. It's a sort of a wistful construct. And he was trying to imagine what's the next thing, and he suggested that it could be something that looks like what we would call an MMO. That's sort of the type of thing he was imagining. But in its place, instead, we have these actual play podcasts where people actually do watch the whole game. But how do you access that environment? That had to be their environment. What do you do with it? And if you're able to make your own expansions of it and have those count, they culturally count somehow. They're allowed. You can take the building blocks of culture, the scripts of behavior, and rearrange them, stitch them back together, edit your own version of an imaginary world, and that has validity, has authority, has canonicity. Word. We might be able to have a collective imaginary entertainment environment, and that's an exciting thing to think about as an aesthete. How do we do this well, and how do we design for it?
Well, I want to riff off something in the chat of this point about actual play groups editing down their shows from Youre. That is, this is a fascinating dynamic to me too. Of like, you produce this 4-hour long thing. Sometimes, some actual plays are 4, 5, 6 hours. It gets edited down to a 10-minute highlight reel or to a wiki. Kiliel, thank you. Or to a much smaller package that people can consume. That then, if they can consume it, then they can riff off it. Then they can do things with it. They can, and I mentioned there's so many different. I think that's another thing that we haven't talked about, which is like the different kind of psychological reasons to want to engage with that kind of culture. So, I think the whole idea of the parasocial relationship, the whole idea of enjoying just like, hey, like lots of people watch their favorite actual play because they like just feeling like they're hanging out with those very kind of funny, talented, creative folks, and it makes them feel more funny and talented and creative. Like, I for sure.
Tarantino has this concept called the hangout film, where are we getting echo? Are you getting echo?
Briefly, but then it went away.
Right, fair enough. This concept called the hangout film, where if the movie is long enough, we begin to feel like we are in a relationship with these people. Not a romantic relationship, but they're our buddies. We're hanging out on the couch together. We got to know them over time. And boy, talk about the parasocial relationship. Both you're spending 300 hours with the Vox Machina on the couch, or whoever your favorite actual play happens to be. That's a lot of time to get to know some people.
It's a lot.
And also, as a scholar, kind of hard to study.
Yeah, and also that thing of like, oh man, when was the last time I spent 6 hours hanging out with my, some distant friend in the busyness of life? It's a fascinating thing. There's just so many angles on this.
What else have we got in that chat?
We should also. I'm seeing the call for questions. I'm seeing a couple of questions in the chat. We could clearly continue talking about this for a very long time.
I suspect we will.
I suspect we will too. I see this question. Does the continuity of a tabletop game make it harder for a drop-in, drop-out audience to get involved? I mean, I can drop in on a video game stream and pretty much be up to speed right away. With a TTRPG stream, I feel like it's much harder if I haven't been there from the start, or is that just me? It's from Joan of Glarg. What do you think about that?
There's a tremendous diversity of the ways that you can do these shows. I mean, we talk about editing as a way to make it more convenient for snack size, but I'm sure that you guys have all heard of Harmon Quest, where we have a very edited version of an actual play show. I mean, not all of them are actual plays. That implies that you're getting all 4 hours unedited of whatever stream. But this is a tabletop RPG show. And for those of you who haven't heard of it, Dan Harmon winds up doing this as a performance for a live audience with a live GM at a table in this 3D space, and then he will animate over it, and you'll have cartoons of like shenanigans that they get up to, and they'll do the voiceover. That is a much more consumable version of this, and it's not wrong. It gets back into our discussions of authenticity. It's not quite as real. It's not quite as parasocial as actually sitting there for the full 4 hours, but that's certainly more consumable. It's a lot friendlier if you're trying to have content that you can just eat up or get an episode of. But I would even challenge the idea though that it's easy to just watch whatever video game. It's very easy to watch Fortnite. There's not a lot of story there. It's just the story of this match. It's like watching ESPN. You don't need continuity in ESPN. But I'm betting if you're watching somebody even play something like a Bloodborne, or God forbid, a Final Fantasy, you're like, oh crap, did I miss episode 17? Ah, geez. And you want to go back and see the story of their playthrough, especially if you haven't played the game yourself and want to get the continuity of the fictional layer of that as well. So, what is your thought, Raph? Is there an ideal way to cut down a tabletop show?
It makes me think about the difference in consuming and experiencing something. So, for example, say you got your favorite sport, whatever that is. There's a big difference between coming at the end of the game and seeing the scoreboard and being like, oh, cool, my team won. Versus being there for I'll pick soccer, right? You're sitting there for 90 minutes and you don't know what's going to happen. You're feeling every moment. There's so much tension that you could argue just ultimately the score just causes that to vanish, but experiencing it in the moment is its own experience, separate from did the team win or did the team lose.
Because we've had so many years to try and figure out how to make sport compelling and how to turn it into a televisual experience.
Totally.
We are super incunabular in the cradle with this actual play turning TRPGs into something you can consume televisually.
Yeah. Well, it makes you think about I don't know too much about it, but I will say I was pretty inspired by reading about the story of how college football came about as very much like a production of the kind of ESPN sphere, where if you manage to take these stories and these rivalries in that like super hyperbolic, hyper alpha, mass, hyper everything, Michael Bay 5-minute intro that they do before the game, where it's just like this school versus this school, they never thought they were going to come back from the brink, blah, 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 explosion. When you watch that, it's a little bit like you're getting in between that experiencing and the consuming. It's someone has condensed that so that you can get back up to speed. So you can, and they've condensed it in this hyperbolic way. So they're like supercharging the emotions instead of you having to spend pro wrestling, exactly. See in the chat as well. Yeah, pro wrestling is really good at this. Is how do you get to the point where you can bring people up to speed by like beating them over the head with something that condenses these 90 minutes of emotion into like.
Even you say that, and I'm thinking of like my personal favorite, the Glass Cannon podcast. Last time on the Glass Cannon podcast, the music comes in, and you have clips of sounds from what happened last time. Will they survive, or will the storm tyrants, etc., etc.? Hell, it's pretty similar to last episode on Game of Thrones, which is its own difficult to swallow huge narrative.
Too soon.
And I know. Believe it or not, as fused a fantasy dork as I am, I just got to the end of season 2, playing catch up right now.
Yeah, you can stop anytime.
I've heard that. Yeah, well, do we have any last thing from the chat? But I see we're almost out of time.
Yeah, I don't know. How do we end this ourselves? I see Andy, our wonderful host and support.
So tell us where we can actually find you online and stuff.
Did we lose Colin? Colin is back. Yay. So you can find me at laughingkaiju.com, where I just post all the games that I make and blog. And if you're curious about the Zone, you can find it at thezonerpg.com. And I tweet just my name, Raftamiko, on Twitter.
Yeah, my handle on Twitter is at Colin Stricklin. That's COLAN STRICKLIN. I imagine it's in the program somewhere. You can also hit up that webcomic I was talking about at handbookofheroes.com. That's handbookofheroes.com. Easy to find. Always happy to talk shop.
Likewise. Man, this has been so fun. It's an absolute blast. I look forward to many more of these conversations. And hey, thanks everyone in the chat too for all the thoughts and comments.
Oh, absolutely. You guys have been great. And I appreciate you changing the performative nature of this discussion. Hey, enjoy the rest of the conference, guys.
Have a good one.